Tetsuya Nomura is a name synonymous with Square Enix and its flagship IP, Final Fantasy VII. With a tenure at the company of over 30 years, he's what we might today regard as a member of the old new guard and one of the most pronounced and indeed controversial figures to lead production teams at the company today. In this episode, we're going to take a look back at the career and controversies of Tetsuya Nomura, appraise his legacy within the games industry and the Final Fantasy saga, and consider how for many gamers he has transitioned from a celebrated prodigy of JRPG concept art to an oft criticised director whose name has become associated with overblown, low-effort storytelling. So let's take ourselves back to 1991 and the beginnings of Nomura's career, where, as was common in the latter 80s and early 90s, the games industry was gaining momentum, but still without the established repute or associated aspiration as a career pathway that it has today. And like many other veterans of Square, such as Yoshinori Kitase, who wanted to be a film director but ended up in games, Nobuo Uematsu, who accidentally ended up in games, Tetsuya Nomura too harboured vague ambitions to be a manga artist or mangaka or advertising graphic artist before he applied for a job at Square, based on his familiarity with Yoshitaka Amano's artwork, who is the celebrated fine art artist who is most known for early Final Fantasy concept art and the logos on the game cases today. Like many junior designers, Tetsuya Nomura began as a generalist. He supplied graphic assets for the games, he dipped into debugging for Final Fantasy IV, and produced several monster concept designs for Final Fantasy V, and owing, probably in large part, to Hironobu Sakaguchi's management style, which was very democratised and delegative and reciprocal, Nomura was periodically acknowledged and praised for contributing his own ideas, his own illustrations, which saw him become one of the 4 graphic directors to work on Final Fantasy VI, which included his mentor at Square, Tetsuya Takahashi. Along with other lead designers on Final Fantasy VI, he was also tasked with going away and coming up with a couple of character ideas for the ensemble cast, and he is often credited with Shadow and Setzer in this game, who found their way into the finished Final Fantasy VI. And as an aside, I just personally love that method for coming up with characters for this game, and it's a good example of how Hironobu Sakaguchi's collaborative ethos ensured that the design process was democratised. So by the mid-1990s we have Nomura making a name for himself at the company, and it's now coming into 1996, where Nomura has established his reliability and competence at Squaresoft, and looking into Final Fantasy VII's release, and indeed its production preceding this, it's where Nomura really began his rise to prominence within Final Fantasy and also the wider games industry, and he became something more of a name to outside audiences because he was the lead character designer on Final Fantasy VII, responsible for creating a myriad of characters, including the iconic Cloud Strife's design, the iconic Sephiroth's design, along with most of the characters of Avalanche right through to the Shinra, and to this day the Cloud and Sephiroth at least established in the canon of iconic video game characters and are a testament to Nomura's legacy and his work in this period. The follow-up game, Final Fantasy VIII, also saw Nomura as the lead character designer, and while the slightly more realistic renderings and homogeneous character portraits here lack the repute of Final Fantasy VII's designs in the popular consciousness, they do certainly show the breadth of Nomura's skill set as an artist, his attentiveness to figurative design and detail. On a purely personal note, the Final Fantasy VIII character designs remain some of my favourites across the series. Along with his character designer work in this period, he also dipped into illustrations on some of the more iconic, unique curios that came out of the Squaresoft era, including Parasite Eve, Brave Fencer Musashi, and the beat-em-up game The Bouncer. Now, coming into the first decade of the 2000s, we have Nomura inch into the next phase of his career, and arguably for those dissenters of him, the first rumblings of his controversial career path takes hold here. But I'd be remiss not to mention his work as a character designer during this period as well. Firstly, he worked on Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XI, which once again showcased his artistic range with the flat, vibrant, slightly anime-leaning style of these respective character designs, and they contrast starkly with the realistic fidelity of Final Fantasy VIII and so on, and his later work on the Final Fantasy VII compilation artwork such as Crisis Core. So perhaps the most notable output by Nomura in this period is his continued work and elevation within the expanding product line of Final Fantasy VII, and his work on the really quite wild Final Fantasy Disney crossover, Kingdom Hearts. And for both Final Fantasy VII and Kingdom Hearts, these were two IPs where he was handed the reins as a director. Firstly, directing the first Kingdom Hearts game in 2002, and he directed the Final Fantasy VII sequel movie, Advent Children, in 2005. And for some, this has been a source of complaint as to how and why a concept artist, such as Nomura, has been elevated to director level. And those that criticise him argue that he was out of his depth, he should have stayed in his lane, and so on. And personally, I find myself disagreeing with this notion for a couple of reasons. The first reason being is that looking at the company culture in Japan across the board, it is generally a vertical, clear-cut career pathway where one elevates through a single company over the majority of their working life. So looking at how personnel within Squaresoft, now Square Enix, have levelled up over the years, we've seen artists, debuggers, coordinators, designers elevate up to directors, producers, and so on. And it just shows the gaming industry is a little bit different, and Nomura's career progression is very typical of that in Japan. Secondly, and more tangibly, as an artist, that it did indeed, alongside Kazushige Najima, create Cloud Strife, there's a strong case that he and Najima should take ownership of that character, as they have done. And indeed, Nomura was strongly encouraged to direct Advent Children as a follow-up instalment to Final Fantasy VII, precisely because of his proximity and knowledge of the character. And this isn't unique to gaming or even design. And I've seen interviews in the past with film actors, for example, such as Gary Oldman, who took on the role of George Smiley in Tinker Tailor. And most recently I saw an old interview with Christopher Lee talking about taking on roles such as Dracula. And what you hear from these artists is that they are hesitant to accept certain roles, and they've outright declined certain roles because they don't want to step into the shoes of another actor's character, or ruin a character that was created in someone else's source material, because they don't feel they know that character in the same way as their originators, as their predecessors. So with this in mind, it makes perfect sense for Nomura to be helming these projects, I think. And while I personally didn't mind Advent Children at all, I think it's quite an inoffensive, abstract continuity to Final Fantasy VII that didn't radically change or take our characters in a new direction. I think a lot of legacy players, legacy gamers that didn't like the compilation at all and just wanted Final Fantasy VII left alone, they sort of take aim a bit more at Nomura because he is the face of it, he is the director of IPs like this. Now, turning to Kingdom Hearts, this series is a different story, and I think as an IP, it's done more than anything to sow the seeds of discontent towards Tetsuya Nomura, because it was his first furtive break from being simply the character designer guy to owning a project from start to finish. And while Kingdom Hearts, at the time of its release in 2002, was pretty unanimously praised, and I personally thought it was a masterpiece, the subsequent installments, starting with Chain of Memories on Game Boy, Kingdom Hearts 2 in 2005, they started becoming quite unwieldy in terms of release, in terms of the platforms they were published on, and specifically the story, which many cited as becoming increasingly verbose, overblown, and hard to follow. And here I think, as director, Nomura would have certainly informed some of that, but also I think dissenters are failing to account for the changes happening at Square during this period too. And throughout the 2000s, we had the merger, we had Yuichi Wada's tenure at Square Enix, and the efforts towards producing excessive amounts of content, polymorphic multi-device content. All of this was in full swing, and so it's no accident perhaps that Kingdom Hearts did start getting these tangent releases across multiple platforms, micro-sequels, prequels, intermediary games, in a similar way that the Final Fantasy VII compilation did. And the story became unwieldy in part because of that. They were bloating it out. And we've all seen it with TV shows and stuff that become successful, so they start putting in bloat episodes and things like that. Very much the same with the games industry, I think. Additionally, after the first two Kingdom Hearts games, Yoshinori Kitase stepped away as producer, and so Nomura and writer Kazushige Najima were left largely to their own devices. And while it's a subjective point here, I think there is a case to be made that this legacy trio of artist, writer, producer tend to work best when the three of them are together. And we've glimpsed it in interviews in the past where they talk about pushing one another and pulling one another, knowing when to rein one another in on certain ideas and things like that. So the absence of Kitase may have accounted for some of this verboseness. So that's the climate of the Kingdom Hearts era, which I think became unwieldy as hell, and Nomura has personally defended the direction which players have taken aim at. But what I would say here is that you can look at staff interviews in any Japanese studio, and particularly Square, and note that the teams will always speak collectively about decisions made, especially for decisions perceived as negative. So even if Nomura didn't personally advocate or write or even want some of these more verbose scenarios in Kingdom Hearts, he does publicly own those decisions as director, and we wouldn't ever know otherwise. Now, coming into the Final Fantasy VII Remake era, we see these two conflicting sides of Nomura and the perceptions of Nomura collide. On the one hand, we have the guy that's responsible for Cloud Strife's design, and on the other we have the guy that directed Kingdom Hearts. And the inevitable fallout of this is that those that dislike the game, they blame to a greater or lesser degree Nomura for their misgivings about the remake saga. But as has since been discussed in interviews, and many were quite surprised about, we have legacy staff like Kitase and Najima coming out and saying that Nomura actually wanted the Final Fantasy VII Remake to track very closely to the original. He wasn't responsible for the wholesale changes and the whispers and all of that sort of thing at all. So quite interesting there, and it shows how he can't necessarily be tarnished for everything that's to do with overblown macro storylines. So what do we make of all of this? Personally, I do believe that Tetsuya Nomura gets a bad rap from dissenters. I think a lot of the verboseness that comes out of his games can only be laid at his door insofar as the director's role is to arrange all the pieces of a puzzle, bring together these different disciplines of scenario writing, coordination and so on, to ensure comprehension and fluidity. However, the sprawl of Kingdom Hearts installments and these tangents like Dream Drop Distance, Chain of Memories, Kingdom Hearts Coded, all of that sort of stuff, these projects are often pitched by a broader team of producers, and of course Disney personnel who are involved in Kingdom Hearts who want to bring these games to other platforms. And in most cases there is evidence to show that Nomura was actually quite hesitant about doing half of these games. But again, as with his responsibility for the handling of Cloud Strife because he created him, so too is he responsible for the handling of Sora, of Roxas, and so on. And so he's pretty much responsible for the deliverables, even if many of the core decisions are out of his hands. So there we have it, a short overview of Tetsuya Nomura's career trajectory, the descent from concept artist wunderkind to questionable director. And I think his directorship of these reputable IPs is nowhere near as reprehensible as the number of belts that he chooses to give some of his character designs. And in the context of Nomura's role as director, it should not be equated with big-name auteurs of the industry, like Hideo Kojima, for example. But Nomura is much more someone who, like Hironobu Sakaguchi before him, operates in a very democratized, delegative and collaborative environment that is ultimately hierarchical and beholden to the executive at Square Enix.